Welcome to South Central Regional Library. I'm Angela and I'm the admin at the Manitou branch, and today I'd like to invite you to take a sneak peek inside a classic novel, Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. Wuthering Heights is not a novel for the faint of heart. It's at times beautiful and at times stark and bleak, very much like the Yorkshire moors where it's set and where Emily Brontë grew up. The Brontes was something of a tragic family. All the children ended up dying at a fairly young age from various illnesses, including Emily, who died from pneumonia at the age of 30. But it was a talented family that produced two published authors, Emily and her sister Charlotte, who wrote Jane Eyre. Emily wrote Wuthering Heights at the age of 28, and she remains somewhat of an enigma, with most of what we know about Emily coming through her poetry, of which she wrote a lot. We know she was very much a homebod. She liked to be at home, and on the couple of occasions when she actually did leave, once for boarding school and then briefly for a visit with Catherine to Belgium, she very quickly became homesick and ended up back at her home on the Yorkshire moors. She seemed just very content to lead a quiet life, writing and caring for her younger sister Anne. We also know she had another side to her character. She could be very headstrong and opinionated, and she certainly wasn't scared to stand up for herself. And I think we see a lot of those characteristics in one of the main characters in Wuthering Heights, Catherine Earnshaw. What speaks volumes to her character, though, I think, is that she and Charlotte both, at the time that they were writing, it was not common or respectable for women to be published authors. And in fact, they both originally published their novels under a male pseudonym. Wuthering Heights revolves around two main characters, Catherine Earnshaw and Heathcliff. Heathcliff is an orphan, adopted by Mr. Earnshaw, Catherine's father, and brought to live at their manor, Wuthering Heights. Heathcliff and Catherine are about the same age, so they quickly become friends and inseparable. And that eventually develops into a very strong bond between them that's hard to define. They obviously have a great love for each other and almost a spiritual connection that is tested throughout their lives with the various things that happen to them, but that is never really broken. Catherine's brother Hindley, however, dislikes Heathcliff from the very beginning, and he's increasingly cruel to him, and especially as his father, Mr. Earnshaw, grows to like Heathcliff more and more, in fact grows to prefer him to his own son. When Mr. Earnshaw dies and Hindley inherits Wuthering Heights, the cruelty to Heathcliff just increases, and he ends up being basically relegated to the role of a servant and eventually leaves. When Heathcliff returns 3 years later, he's a very wealthy man, and we never do find out how he made his wealth. We don't know that. But when he returns, he discovers, of course, that Catherine, in the meanwhile, has married Edgar Linton, son of the owners of the neighbouring manor, Thrushcross Grange. Heathcliff and Catherine are reunited in a scene that is very passionate and tortured. There are recriminations on both sides. Heathcliff is obviously very upset that Catherine has married Edgar, and she is very upset that he left without a word and disappeared for 3 years. And it's obvious that their relationship, although they are still very, very strongly connected to each other, is now being tested severely. But shortly after their reunion, Catherine falls ill, and she dies giving birth to her daughter, who is also called Catherine. From that point on, the whole story revolves around Heathcliff's desire for revenge upon the people that he feels have wronged him, Edgar Linton, Hindley Earnshaw, and the relationships between those two families become very, very complex and ever more intertwined. Now, the excerpt I'm going to read takes place just after Catherine's death, and it sets the stage, I think, for the rest of the novel, and for Heathcliff's determination to seek retribution from everyone, including, oddly, his beloved Catherine. The scene is narrated by Nellie Dean, who is currently the housekeeper at Thrushcross Grange, and she was previously the nanny to the Earnshaw children at Wuthering Heights. The master looked asleep, and I ventured soon after sunrise to quit the room and shake off the drowsiness of my protracted watch. In reality, my chief motive was seeing Mr. Heathcliff. If he had remained among the larches all night, he would have heard nothing of the stir at the Grange, unless perhaps he might catch the gallop of the messenger going to Gimmerton. If he had come nearer, he would probably be aware, from the lights flitting to and fro in the opening and shutting of the outer doors, that all was not right within. I wished yet feared to find him. I felt the terrible news must be told, and I longed to get it over, but how to do it, I did not know. He was there, at least a few yards farther in the park, leant against an old ash tree, his hat off and his hair soaked with the dew that had gathered on the budding branches and fell pattering around him. He had been standing a long time in that position, for I saw a pair of ouzels passing and repassing, scarcely 3 feet from him, busy in building their nest, and regarding his proximity no more than that of a piece of timber. They flew off at my approach, and he raised his eyes and spoke. "She's dead," he said. "I've not waited for you to learn that. Put your handkerchief away. Don't snivel before me. Damn you all. She wants none of your tears." I was weeping as much for him as her. We do sometimes pity creatures that have none of the feeling either for themselves or others. When I first looked into his face, I perceived that he had got intelligence of the catastrophe, and a foolish notion struck me that his heart was quelled and he prayed, because his lips moved and his gaze was bent on the ground. "Yes, she's dead," I answered, checking my sobs and drying my cheeks. "Gone to heaven, I hope, where we may every one join her if we take due warning and leave our evil ways to follow good." "Did she take due warning then?" asked Heathcliff, attempting a sneer. "Did she die like a saint? Come, give me a true history of the event. How did she—" He endeavoured to pronounce the name, but could not manage it, and compressing his mouth, he held a silent combat with his inward agony, defying meanwhile my sympathy with an unflinching, ferocious stare. "How did she die?" he resumed at last, fain notwithstanding his hardiness to have a support behind him, for after the struggle he trembled in spite of himself to his very fingertips. "Poor wretch," I thought. "You have a heart and nerves the same as your brother men. Why should you be so anxious to conceal them? Your pride cannot blind God. You tempt him to wring them till he forces a cry of humiliation." "Quietly as a lamb," I answered aloud. She drew a sigh and stretched herself like a child reviving and sinking again to sleep, and 5 minutes after I felt one little pulse at her heart and nothing more. "And did she ever mention me?" he asked, hesitating as if he dreaded the answer to his question would introduce details that he could not bear to hear. "Her senses never returned. She recognised nobody from the time you left her," I said. She lies with a sweet smile on her face, and her latest ideas wandered back to pleasant early days. Her life closed in a gentle dream. May she wake as kindly in the other world." "May she wake in torment," he cried with a frightful vehemence, stamping his foot and groaning in a sudden paroxysm of ungovernable passion. "Why, she's a liar to the end. Where is she? Not there. Not in heaven. Not perished. Where? Oh, you said you cared nothing for my sufferings, and I pray one prayer. I repeat it till my tongue stiffens. Catherine Earnshaw, may you not rest as long as I am living. You said I killed you. Haunt me then. The murdered do haunt their murderers, I believe. I know that ghosts have wandered the earth. Be with me always. Take any form. Drive me mad. Only do not leave me in this abyss, where I cannot find you. Oh God, it is unutterable. I cannot live without my life. I cannot live without my soul." He dashed his head against the knotted trunk and, lifting up his eyes, howled, not like a man, but like a savage beast getting goaded to death with knives and spears. I observed several splashes of blood around the bark of the tree, and his hand and forehead were both stained. Probably the scene I witnessed was a repetition of others acted during the night. It hardly moved my compassion. It appalled me. Still, I felt reluctant to quit him so. But But the moment he recollected himself enough to notice me watching, he thundered a command for me to go, and I obeyed. He was beyond my skill to quiet or console. Mrs. Linton's funeral was appointed to take place on the Friday following her decease. Until then, her coffin remained uncovered and strewn with flowers and scented leaves in the great drawing room. Linton spent his days and nights there, a sleepless guardian, and a circumstance concealed from all but me, Heathcliff spent his nights at least outside, equally a stranger to repose. I held no communication with him, still I was conscious of his design to enter if he could, and on the Tuesday, a little after dark, when my master from sheer fatigue had been compelled to retire a couple of hours, I went and opened one of the windows, moved by his perseverance, to give him a chance of bestowing on the faded image of his idol one final adieu. He did not omit to avail himself of the opportunity, cautiously and briefly, too cautiously to betray his presence by the slightest noise. Indeed, I shouldn't have discovered that he had been there, except for the disarrangement of the drapery around the corpse's face, and for observing on the floor a curl of light hair, fastened with a silver thread, which on examination I ascertained to have been taken from a locket hung around Catherine's neck. Heathcliff had opened the trinket and cast out its contents, replacing them by a black lock of his own. I twisted the two and enclosed them together. I hope you've enjoyed this excerpt from Wuthering Heights by Emily Brontë. Thank you for joining us.